الهدى يا شهر الندى.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه الطيبين الطاهرين. We start with the name of Allah. We praise and thank Allah for all of the endowments that He bestowed, without Allah being obligated to give anything. And we ask Allah to raise the rank of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and the ranks of his wives, believing relatives, companions, and those who followed them sincerely until Judgment Day. And we ask Allah to protect the nation of Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam from what the Prophet feared for his nation. Thereafter, we're continuing in the summary of Sheikh Abdullah Al-Harariyy rahimahullah ta'ala, and in the last session we completed talking about conditions for the rewardability of the prayer, and now, God willing, we will enter into the section of the integrals of the prayer. And as you may know, an integral here, which we call a rukun in Arabic, or a wajib, or a fard, these are aspects, parts of an act of worship that the act of worship is not valid without. So here, in talking about the integrals of the prayer, we're talking about actual parts of the prayer that the prayer is not valid without. Previously, we talked about numerous conditions for the validity of the prayer, but those matters are not a part of the prayer, whereas these integrals are. The author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy upon him, said, the integrals of the prayer are 17. The first integral is the intention in the heart to perform the prayer, to specify the cause or time of prayer, and to specify it being obligatory when it is so. So the first integral here is for one to have the intention. And the intention is a deed of the heart. It takes place in the heart. One intends to pray, but when praying an obligatory prayer, then one needs to add to that mere intention that it is obligatory. And if the prayer has a specific time, like the 5 daily prayers, or, for example, certain specific optional prayers, like the duha prayer, then one would specify that time in their intention. Or if the prayer had a specific reason, like, for example, the funeral prayer, then one would specify that reason in the prayer, in one's intention. And if it wasn't a prayer that had a specific time or reason, rather it was an unrestricted optional prayer, what's called mutlaq prayer, a prayer that is naflul mutlaq, then they could just intend to pray without those additional matters being added to the intention. The author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, said the second integral is to say Allahu Akbar loud enough to hear oneself, as is required in every verbal integral. So everything that is required for one to say in the prayer, one has to say it at least at a volume in which one could hear oneself. Not that others could hear one. And this consideration is considering that one's environment is peaceful, tranquil, not with environmental noise. So a person is not required to raise their voice loudly if there are loud things going on around them in their environment. Likewise, a person should be very mindful of not doing what disturbs and distracts others in their prayer. One may know that other imams of Ahl Sunnah do not require the follower to recite the Fatiha in the prayer, when they're following an imam, because the imam's recitation is considered that it would cover the recitation of the follower. And this is how many of the Muslims grew up, this is what they learn and this is what they understand. So we, followers of the Shafi'i madhab, or those who have taken knowledge from this route, we need to be very mindful not to raise our voices unnecessarily, raise them to a loud voice when we're praying behind an imam, to recite the Fatiha and other parts of the prayer in a way that would distract those around us. We should recite in a way that's a low volume, but that we could hear ourselves. And a person can speak like that in a way that the person who's to either side of them cannot hear them. So if a person's having issues with that, then they can practice outside of the prayer, reciting at a lower tone while still being audible to themselves. When one says the takbirah, they have to be mindful of the expression and not make certain errors that would corrupt the meaning and cause the prayer not to commence in the first place. For example, one would not extend the hamza in Allahu Akbar, thus saying Allahu Akbar. This corrupts the meaning and one's prayer would not commence. And if one understood the meaning, it would be blasphemous because it turns this statement into an inquiry, as if one's saying, is Allah the greatest? Likewise, one would not add a wow between the name of Allah and the word Akbar, like saying Allahu Akbar. Nor would he do something that resembles erasing the Hamza of Akbar, like some people say Allahu Akbar. Alright? This would not be valid. One needs to make sure to pronounce the Hamza Allahu Akbar, the Akbar. MashaAllah. And this is similar to the scenario of one replacing the Hamza with a Waw if someone said Allahu Akbar, for example. This is not valid. Likewise, one would not extend after the Ba in Akbar, thus saying Allahu Akbar. This also corrupts the meaning and would change the meaning to saying that Allah is big drums. And this is, of course, blasphemous. So the one who says it intentionally while knowing its meaning would not be judged as a Muslim after that. And the third integral, as the author mentioned, he said, is to stand al-qiyam for the obligatory prayer when one is able. So one is obligated to stand for the obligatory prayer. They're not allowed to sit as they are allowed in the optional prayers or to lay, unless they had a religiously valid excuse by not being able to stand. If one was unable to stand on his own or even with help, then he would sit in the prayer. If he is unable to sit, then he would lay in the prayer. He would lay, but with his head and part of his chest elevated so that he would not just be facing the sky in his prayer. And there are other details mentioned about these matters that we won't mention here because this is more of a summary. He said, thus, so be mindful, brothers and sisters, if a person has the ability to stand in the prayer, the obligatory prayer, and he sits, then his prayer would not be valid. Then the author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy upon him, said, the fourth integral is to recite Al-Fatiha, including the Basmala and the doubling of the letters that should be doubled. In the Shafi'i school, the Basmala, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, is considered a part of the Fatiha. This is considered a part of the Fatiha. So one is required to recite it for the validity of their recitation and thus the validity of their prayer. And one must double all of the letters that must be doubled. These are called at-tashdidat, the shaddas. There are 14 places in Al-Fatiha that have these doubled letters, these shaddas. So if a person left out reciting one of them, then actually they're dropping one of the letters of Al-Fatiha. And so to recite the Fatiha properly, correctly, one must recite all of these shaddas. Like, for example, when you say Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, that's 1, 2, and 3. Bismillah, the lamb, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. So the lam in Lillah and the ba in Rabbil Alameen. So that's 5 altogether. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim, that's 2 more, equaling 7. Maliki Yawmiddin, the dal in Yawmiddin, that's an additional, making 8. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, the ya in Iyyaka and the ya in wa iyyaka, bringing us to is that 10? We were at 8, and then 9, 10. Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. The sad in as-sirat, bringing us to 11, if I'm counting correctly. Sirat al-ladhina an'amta alayhim غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. I think I skipped one. I think I was at 9 and then I went back to 8. So there's 14 altogether. And Allah Ta'ala knows best. Subhanallah. So one must recite all of the shaddas that are in the Fatiha for the validity of their recitation and thus the validity of the prayer. He said it is also mandatory to maintain the succession and order of the surah. So when one recites the Fatiha for the prayer, they need to not interrupt between the recitation, the expressions in the Fatiha, a lengthy interruption. And this means that they should not interrupt for more than what is called saktatut tanaffus, which is the silence that one takes for breathing, which is the duration that one would stop talking to breathe if one was in conversation normally. So if a person without a religiously valid excuse interrupted between the expressions of the Fatiha with what's more than this silence of breathing, then their recitation, the succession of their recitation would be invalidated, and so they would be required to go back and start their recitation from scratch, al-istitnaf. And if they didn't do that, then they would be missing out on something necessary for their recitation, and thus their prayer would not be valid. He said in the order of the surah, so one wouldn't recite the Fatiha out of its well-known order. They wouldn't, for example, start with Maliki Yawmiddin, then go back to Ar-Rahmanir Rahim, then go to Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, even if they recited all 7 verses, if that was done out of order. He said to articulate the letters properly, because that's how one recites the verses properly. That's how one's recitation is correct, by pronouncing every letter from its proper exit. That's how, and he's saying it from its exit is how you pronounce it. And so if a person did not say the letter from its exit, then he has not pronounced it properly. And so then he would have made an error in his recitation. He said, and to avoid the error which breaches the meaning, such as applying a dhamma, which is the u vowel, a-e-u, the u is the dhamma, to the letter ta in the word an'amta, thus saying an'amtu. This would invalidate one's recitation. They would, if they did it by mistake, then they would be required to go back and recite it properly, to correct it. He said the error that does not breach the meaning is sinful. However, it does not invalidate the prayer. Then the author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, said the 5th integral is to bow until one's palms could reach one's knees. The palm of the hand is the part of the hand that is between the fingers and the wrist. All right, so this is the palm of the hand. So one is required to bow enough so that that part of his hand could reach his knees, but actually placing them on the knees is not a requirement. If one bowed only enough so that, for example, the fingertips of his fingertips could reach his knees without his palms being able to reach them, then he would not be bowing enough, and so his ruku' would not be valid. And if he didn't correct that, then his prayer would not be valid. However, this is all with the consideration of one that has normal length arms. So if a person had extremely long arms for his proportions, in a way that he wasn't required to bow at all, or very slightly for his palms to reach his knees, then he would be required to bow more than that, because he needs to bow as much as his palms would reach his knees had he had normal length arms. Likewise, the individual with extremely short arms doesn't need to bow in a very extreme way so that he could actually get his palms to his knees. Rather, he needs to bend in a way in which his palms could reach his knees had he had arms of moderate length. Then the author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, said the sixth integral is at-tuma'nina, which is having stillness in the prayer. He said, in ruku', having stillness in this position, for the duration of saying Subhanallah, which is an example. He said, that is, for each bone to settle in its place simultaneously. Saying that one must be still for the duration of saying Subhanallah is an example, meaning that had a person had stillness for the duration that it takes to say Subhanallah, then this would be sufficient for the tuma'nina. However, if, for example, he wasn't still for quite that long, however, he had some stillness that separates one movement from another, like the bowing from al-i'tidal, straightening back up, then this would be a sufficient a sufficient duration of tuma'nina. The author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, said the seventh integral is al-i'tidal, that is, to straighten up after ruku'. So the person goes back to the position that he was in before bowing. So if he was standing, then he goes back to standing. If he was sitting, then he goes back to sitting. The eighth integral is at-tuma'nina in the i'tidal. So when one raises back up after bowing, then he has stillness in that position as well. He said the ninth integral is to prostrate, which is to make sujood twice, 2 times, by pressing all or part of one's bare forehead on to one's place of prayer or prayer surface, while keeping the lower half of one's body higher than the upper half, which is called in Arabic at-tankis, along with placing part of one's knees, part of the inside of one's hands, and part of the bottom part of one's toes on the place of prayer. So when one makes sujood, he makes it twice, and as the author will mention, he sits between those 2 prostrations. In every prostration, one's upper body will be lower than one's lower body, and this is called tankis. And in the Shafi'i school, it is required for the validity of one's prostration. One must put the all or part of one's uncovered forehead onto the prayer surface as well. So had a person, for example, been wearing a kufi like this, or wearing a turban that covered part of his forehead, and then he put the part of the forehead on the ground that's covered by the turban, so thus his bare forehead was not touching the prayer surface, then that sujood would not be valid. Likewise, one needs to put one's knees on the ground, and the inside part of one's hands, not the backhand side, for example, and the underside of some of the toes of both feet. So one wouldn't place the top of his foot on the ground in a way that the underside of his foot is just facing up, and the nails of his feet are on the ground, the nails of his toes are on the ground, while the underside of his toes are faced upwards. Rather, one needs to put the underside of the toes on the ground in a way where he would be pressing them down. It doesn't have to be all 10 toes, but at least some of them. This is according to the Shafi'i school, and this is necessary for one's sujood, one's prostration, to be sufficient. When one puts one's forehead on the ground, he doesn't have to press hard, pushing his forehead into the prayer surface. However, there is a minute amount of pressure that should be there. The scholars mentioned that there should be enough pressure that had there been cotton below where his forehead is, that cotton would be compressed, and if his hand was under the cotton, then he would feel the effects of that. He would feel the effects of that. That's the extent of pressure, not a lot of pressure. And Allah the Exalted knows best. God willing, we'll stop here so that we can continue in the next lesson. Walhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
يا شهر الخيرات والإحسان والبركات يا رمضان